Welcome to Ask Fear and Greed, where we take your questions and do our very, very best to answer them. I'm Michael Thompson, and good afternoon, Sean Aylmer.
Good afternoon, Michael. I agree. We do our best to answer them.
Yeah, last time I chimed in, and I don't think I helped the situation at all.
No, you did. You did. Definitely.
Thanks. That's very kind. Great question today from Cara via Instagram. You can jump onto Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook or our website, fearandgreed.com.au, and send your questions through. Cara wants to know, she says, you talked about Telstra upping mobile phone prices above the rate of inflation and the fact that this is an example of services inflation. Doesn't Telstra, and this is really interesting, Sean, doesn't Telstra, as the country's biggest telco, have an obligation to help the economy and not put more pressure on prices?
Oh, and of course, because we all use mobile phones. Like, we don't have a choice in that anymore. Mm-hmm. Great question. The short answer is maybe that used to be the case, but it isn't anymore. Now, let me explain that. Telstra actually doesn't have any responsibility to look after we citizens.
Oh.
It used to. It was owned by the government, but now it's listed. It actually needs to look after shareholders. Now, it's not mutually exclusive, so looking after customers and having a good marketing team and good PR actually can mean looking after shareholders because profits might be better. So it's not really mutually exclusive, but by the law, they don't have to give a toss about citizens. They do have to give a toss about shareholders. This introduces, though, Michael, I'm going to get excited. This is about microeconomic reform. So
you genuinely do look excited by this.
Oh, yeah. So like when I'm thinking this question through, because there's been this microeconomic reform over decades, really, it's allowed Telstra to not have to worry about society and to worry more about returns. So I'll tell you, microeconomic reform, we don't talk much about it, but it has changed the way Australia works. There's kind of big picture microeconomic reform, which is sort of, I think it's a contradiction in terms, microeconomic reform being big picture. But things like the removal of tariffs and protectionist policies, the big one was the car industry a few decades ago. Ultimately, that led to the dismantling of car manufacturing in Australia. But given cars are much cheaper to build in other places, that's not bad. It's a good thing. We're paying less for cars now. There's microeconomic reform around corporatisation and privatisation of government business monopolies. I mean, Telstra is a big one there. Commonwealth Bank, that's another good example. There's also been deregulation of industries. Qantas is an example there. But generally, they're much smaller bits and pieces of reform, which have almost been as important. In fact, they probably have been more important. And this comes to this Telstra question. Because the law now requires telcos to allow customers to keep their numbers when they change providers, that's actually microeconomic reform, right? Then there's much more competition in the market. So I remember changing my provider 15 years ago and I had to get a new number. Nowadays, though, if I change my provider, I can take my number with me. So if Telstra puts up its prices as a customer, I have every right to change providers and I can keep my phone number, the one that I've had for years. That's good for me. It's also good for Telstra because it doesn't have a moral obligation to actually look after me or anyone else anymore. Another example of this microeconomic reform is what's called open banking in Australia. Since 2020, you can give permission for third parties to access your savings and credit data, give them information about your mortgage, personal loan, joint bank accounts, etc. The theory is that this should make it easier to find a better loan or change banks, actually. Hasn't quite worked out that way. I think the jury's still out on that particular microeconomic reform. But bring this back to Telstra. Because we've had this microeconomic reform, it means we can keep our phone numbers. So therefore, the question is, doesn't Telstra have some sort of moral obligation because of high inflation to not push up prices? I'd say absolutely not, because I can quite easily walk. I can quite easily go to Optus or Vodafone or Aldi or somewhere like that for my phone services. Telstra's obligation is to make a return for shareholders, and we've seen its share price go up the last couple of days as a result of these reforms. So I don't think it has that responsibility anymore.
It's a good point that you make, and you mentioned Aldi just there as well, because otherwise you would say, yeah, okay, I can walk. I could go to Optus, I could go to Vodafone, but everyone has put their prices up this year and by some kind of fairly significant leaps. But then there's a second tier of providers then in Australia that essentially piggyback off these primary providers. You've got like your Aldi and your Amaysim and your Belong and your More Mobile and things which actually hire essentially or use the networks of Telstra and of Optus, and you can just kind of pick and choose and substantially lower prices. So there is that kind of competition within the industry, isn't there?
Yeah, because of microeconomic reform. That's exactly right. So it's a great question because it kind of intuitively makes sense. But Telstra's not owned by the government anymore. It's owned by shareholders, so it actually doesn't have to look after us.
You know what, Sean? I think that is a great question. And I'm also particularly impressed with my own contribution that I don't think I stuffed it up today.
You didn't stuff it up earlier in the week either.
Oh, I know, but one of those ones where you're just like, where you get to the end of it and you're like, I don't know if what I just said made any sense whatsoever.
It did.
And today I'm even more confident of that. So thank you, Cara. Thank you, me as well. And thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael. And especially thank you, Cara.
Yes, indeed. If you have a question that you would like us to answer, if you'd like, in particular, Sean to answer, then jump online, send it in via LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, or at fearandgreed.com.au. Don't forget to hit follow on the podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and this is Ask Fear and Greed.